In the late 1880s, the Royal Navy had been experimenting to see what kind of battleship was ideal for them, with most of the argument centred on whether more numerous 13.5-inch guns or fewer but more powerful 16.5-inch guns were preferable, as you could have one of the larger guns instead of two of the smaller ones. There was also some argument as a result as to whether splitting the armament fore and aft, or concentrating it all forward, was a better idea. However, during the 1880s, the Royal Navy had built relatively few battleships, and technology continued to progress. Toward the end of this period, a number of public and private factors conspired to highlight these weaknesses, and the Navy was provided with a significant increase in budget centred around the two-power standard, whereby the Royal Navy was now to be provided with the resources to fight the next two largest navies on the planet combined. This meant, instead of building a couple of battleships and then moving on to the next class, this class was to be 8 vessels strong. The Director of Naval Construction took the previous Trafalgar class as a starting point, but whereas previously British capital ships had used the large cylindrical turrets that had been pretty much the default since the 1860s, he managed instead to argue that by eliminating these, and instead having the guns mounted in open barbettes, whose gun pit would provide cover against incoming horizontal fire for the gun crew, the saved weight would allow the vessels to have a considerably higher freeboard. This would allow the ships to keep up speed in heavier weather, and allow the crews to work the guns in higher seas, which would give them a combat and manoeuvre advantage. Combined with a 2-shaft vertical triple expansion power plant of 11,000 indicated horsepower that was capable of sending the ships through the water at between 17 and 18 knots, depending on if you used forced draft, it was a persuasive argument. Almost. The first Sea Lords still thought low freeboard ships with fully armoured turrets were a good idea, and so a compromise was reached. 7 ships would be built to the higher freeboard design, and one, HMS Hood, was to be built with the same main battery, but in the older style turrets, with the only other changes being the necessary lowering of freeboard to keep her stable enough to not repeat the HMS Captain incident. Armour protection was to be compound armour, which was a steel plate over an iron plate. This would be up to 18 inches thick on the belt, up to 17 inches thick on the barbettes, and in Hood's case a similar thickness on the turrets, with up to 3 inches of deck armour. Partway through the design process, the advent of Harvey and regular nickel steel as reliable armour meant that some of the thinner plates of the distributed armour scheme would have these materials used instead of compound armour. Armament consisted of 4 13.5-inch 30 caliber guns mounted in pairs fore and aft, with 10 single 6-inch guns, 5 per side, plus numerous 6-pounder and 3-pounder, or 57mm and 47mm anti-torpedo boat guns scattered across the ships. Additionally, there were no less than 7 torpedo tubes, 3 per side and 1 at the stern, with 1 on each side being submerged and the rest being above the waterline. A small degree of tumble home, more often found on French ships, was also included in an effort to help reduce top weight. Unsurprisingly, Hood found itself often slowed by high seas and unable to work its guns when the seas got rough. But it was also found that the other ships all rolled considerably more than predicted, and so bilge keels were fitted to the ships that were still under construction and retrofitted to those that had already entered service. All ships were laid down in 1889 and 1890, except for Revenge, which was laid down in February 1891. All of them would launch in 1891 or 1892 and would commission between spring 1893 and 1894, except for the Royal Sovereign, which came into service a year earlier than any of her sisters. Although quite capable at the time, they were quickly surpassed by the next class of battleship, the Majestics, which laid down a definitive formula for what we would now call a pre-dreadnought. And so, during the 1900s, the Royal Sovereigns received a series of refits, which mostly focused on downscaling the light anti-torpedo boat and torpedo batteries, and improving the survivability of the 6-inch guns, as well as installing fire control equipment such as rangefinders. With numerous true pre-dreadnoughts in service, and Dreadnought herself about to be laid down, the class went into reserve in the mid-1900s, and by the early 1910s, they were being taken out of service entirely and scrapped, or, in the case of Empress of India, used as a target. 2 ships would survive this general cull for a while. Hood was used to test torpedo defences, and was then scuttled in Portland Harbour, where her remains are still visible today, and Revenge was used as a gunnery training ship until 1913. The outbreak of World War I the next year saved her from the scrappers, and she was used as a giant monitor for the first half of the war, then as an accommodation ship as more specialist designs took up the monitor role, and she gave up her name in 1915 so that the lead ship of the Revenge-class super dreadnoughts could use it. Now Redoutable, or Redoubtable, she continued to accommodate sailors until late 1919, when she was also finally sent to the breakers.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.